As we move past Constitution Day here in the Commonwealth, a document fairly entrenched in the psyche of Virginians since most of the particulars in the founding of this nation were Virginian, especially in the conflict and the friction over developing the U.S. Constitution, its misuse and its weaponization is never seen more than at the corner of a farm drive and the main road going by it. And the author of the book, Everything I Want to Do Is Illegal, as well as many others, and a great farmer who owns Polyface Farms in the Shenandoah Valley, editor of the Stockman Grass Farmer now as well, but one of the great activists on behalf of those who make our food. And it's one of those groups that you really don't imagine should need somebody to go out and defend them. We should all be doing that. He is Joel Salatin. Joel, welcome back to Freedom and Prosperity Radio. How are you doing, sir?
I'm doing great. Thank you very much for having me.
Well, as I do with many of the folks who fight Obamacare and the single-payer health system and many of the other things that we get into, I look back over the 10 or 11 years I've been doing this show and thinking, gosh, I really wish we had made a little bit more progress over the election. I would have thought anyway. I would have guessed. I think one of the times we talked, Joel, the Commonwealth of Virginia had just enacted a law that gave farmers permission to sell the stuff they grow on their farms. And you read it, and you have to read it a second time. This goes back 3 or 4 years. You read it 2 or 3 times before you say, why did we need to pass a law that gives a farmer permission to sell the stuff that they grow on their farms? But this is the kind of Commonwealth we live in right now, and it still continues, doesn't it?
Well, yeah, and it doesn't seem to let up too much. We've still got tremendous zoning and food, marketing hurdles that affect us and create a lot of hurdles for local food systems. I mean, to be able to do neighbor-to-neighbor commerce freely is not possible, and at least legally. And so what we have is an increasing, stigma and marginalization and criminalization of things that, we have done for a long, long time. I mean, the founders couldn't have imagined that there would be a day when if a neighbor came over and said, hey, I love this homemade pepperoni you're making here, could I buy some, that it would be illegal for you to be able to sell a pepperoni to a neighbor.
Well, what is the premise? Is the premise really that, you're ripping somebody off? Because I can only imagine that the government would jump in under the idea that somehow they're protecting us from ourselves, that we're going to be duped into buying your tomatoes or your pork or something along those lines.
Well, yeah, the whole impetus for this, I think there are two things. One is food safety, that if we don't have a bureaucrat between every food transaction in the Commonwealth, and I've actually had, the people in charge of food inspection in the state of Virginia tell me, I mean, I've put the quotations in my books, that that consumers are too ignorant to make food choices, that you can't trust them to make food choices. So there must be a bureaucrat in between the producer and the consumer in order to ensure food safety. And and of course that plays right in to the hands of the henny penny, Ralph Nader writes consumer advocacy folks who think that government oversight is the only way that we can be protected from ourselves. So that's certainly one. The second element is one that it's around zoning. That farmland, agricultural land, is the new. I mean, I'm sure you've heard the term green space.
Yeah.
And so there's this kind of increasing mentality in the culture with urbanization and the segregation between the urban and the rural, without much activity going on between the two, that that agriculture land is really the nation's playground. You know, it's where we can go on Sunday morning with our kids and bike.
You can hike through. I think Britain has something. It's called like I forget what the law is called, but where you can just basically hike across everyone's farm, because European cities are like that. I mean, it's almost like the old Roman wall. You get to the wall and then you got nothing. Right.
And so what's happened is when people who make money in the urban sector then purchase land in the country, which is happening more and more as farmers age out, then this and also brings this perception. Many of these folks aren't actually actively farming the land. They just mow it. It's kind of their residential estate.
Right.
They might only have a couple of acres, but they sure as dickens don't want anybody from the city coming out, invading their private space.
Mm-hmm.
And so what we have is increasingly strident segregation from commerce, so that farms are viewed as essentially, colonial producers of raw materials to be value added somewhere else, and nobody is supposed to come out onto farms because that invades this basically elite quiet space, green space.
Well,
that we have out here.
Let me poke into that.
So there's a lot of zoning as well. I mean, for example, we can't right now on our farm, we cannot go to the woods, cut a tree. We have a band sawmill, so we can mill it into lumber on our sawmill, but we can't take that lumber and turn it into a chair and sell it on our farm, because making a chair is manufacturing, and manufacturing is illegal in an agriculture zone. That's the kind of market commercial segregation I'm talking about.
Well, and let me ask you this, Joel, because we see this frequently in rural Virginia. Is you mentioned, especially within the 100 to 150 mile areas around D.C. and Norfolk, you're seeing more and more people move out into those areas, buy a farm, as you mentioned, a farmer aging out, and the estate taxes making it ridiculously inaffordable, if not just downright laughable, for the son or the daughter to take over the farm and still be able to pay the bills, because everything would be going into the estate tax. But so somebody is able to buy somebody's farm. They're not interested in farming. I also see them going to the zoning boards, both at the state and the local levels, and saying, hold it, I don't want somebody farming next to me. Somebody's growing wine next to me, and he's got tractors running, or he's got a winery, and he might host events, or he's got a pumpkin patch, and every October he's got all these kids coming here, and I don't want that. I didn't buy my multi-million-dollar farm just to have farming going on next to it. And it seems ludicrous, but it happens all the time.
Well, it's you're hitting the nail on the head. So far, you're batting 100. I mean, this is absolutely the kind of thing that what it does is it keeps farmers like us who want to engage with the urban sector, who want to bring economies back to rural environments, who realize that the constant flow of wealth from rural to urban is actually not a healthy one-way flow. That flow has to come back.
Yep.
And so those of us who want to participate in the commercial sector, in food and fiber commercial sector, directly and interface directly with customers. We could even say those of us who want to re-embed the butcher, the baker, and the candlestick maker in the community, in the village, we are then demonized by, we can just call it the elitist fraternity that wants to maintain this bifurcated economy. And so, we've our country, I don't want to go through racial segregation. We've gone through that and all the turmoil of that. And what's happening now is increasing economic segregation, not the least of which is the inability of us rural people to access high-speed Wi-Fi. It's hard for us, for example, in our on-farm store to process credit cards. We can, about 50% of the time we can do it. 50% of the time we can't. That's a very big aggravation in being able to access. And so these are all things that are increasingly creating economic segregation in the country, which is just as devastating as racial segregation.
Joel Salatin is on with us this week, Freedom and Prosperity Radio, polyfacefarms.com. If you go out and he'll give you a tour, it is. If you painted a picture, if Norman Rockwell was still around, Joel, he'd paint a picture of your farm. It is American farming, and we should be encouraging this. In my mind, I see it in so many sectors, and maybe I've just been around this too much. I've developed some sort of disease from it. But I see every part of American life becoming centralized, whether we allow it because of convenience or because of sloth, I'm not sure, but we centralize broadcasting, we centralize news, we centralize grocery, we centralize retail, and then we centralize government so that we centralize internet service. We're centralizing farming as well. We're getting rid of the family farms in order to just say magically a crate of tomatoes appears from somewhere. But that's horribly dangerous, and perhaps more so to the agricultural industry than any others. Yeah,
well, the centralized farming that you're describing, yes, is. I'd like to just suss out a little nuance of that.
Sure.
What's happened is that with the industrialization of food and factory farming and Tyson chicken houses and all that sort of thing, it's not like farming's not occurring. Farming's certainly happening, but the highly relational element of the farm of yesteryear, where, as I said, the butcher, the baker, the candlestick maker, tanning hides, all of the things that were done on the farm. I mean, in 1946. The average food in America only traveled 40 miles from farm to plate. In 1946, the average morsel of food traveled 40 miles. Today, it's 1,500 miles.
Jeez.
That is an indicator of centralization of production and centralization of processing. During that time, what's happened is culturally, we've come out of the kitchen. We've started eating more and more convenience foods. I mean, I don't know how old you are, but when I was growing up, goodness, if we ate out, it was a big deal. You did it at
got dressed up
and birthdays, and I mean, I don't think our family ate out more than, I'm just going to say, half a dozen times in a year. Today, half of all meals are eaten outside the home, and 30% are eaten in a car. So in order, here's the deal: the proportion of the retail dollar in food that the farmer is getting has dropped from somewhere in the neighborhood of 60% 40 years ago to now it's down to 10%. And that's an indicator, that we're eating more convenience foods that are more expensive, that take a lot more processing and value adding, but B, that the farmer is not accessing any of those retail dollars. So to bring the point home, we could have an ag policy tomorrow that said from now on, we're not going to pay farmers anything. Farmers have to grow food, and they don't get paid anything, and it would only change the price of food 10%. That's how little the farmer gets. And so those of us that are out here looking at this economic reality, we're saying, wow, the only way to stay viable is to actually capture a larger percentage of that retail dollar. How do we do that? Well, we don't just raise chickens for a nickel margin apiece. We turn those chickens into pot pies and chicken soup and broth. And we don't just raise tomatoes to sell, to sell tomatoes to a Campbell soup cannery. No, we sell those tomatoes as tomatoes, or we turn them into ketchup, or we turn them into
yourself.
salsa.
But then now you're back at manufacturing. Now you're back at manufacturing on a farm that's verboten that. So what is the answer? Where do we begin, cutting this bramble down? I pulled some old scrubby juniper off the side of my house because it had just grown wild and was in everything's way. It seems like that's almost metaphoric for what you're describing in terms of our economic regulations. How do we start pruning this back, Joel?
Well, there are a couple things we can do, both culturally and personally. So the best thing you can do personally is to simply not patronize the supermarket, the mainline, the mainline food system. So take your dollars and vote for a decentralized system, whether it's at the farmer's market, an individual farm. Mm-hmm. Shoot, now we can even ship. We're shipping across the country now with the logistics of distribution. That's so much easier. We can now, reach people that we could never reach 30 years ago, and do it pretty cheaply, actually, with distribution logistics. So you can buy directly from a farmer. The point is to take your food dollars and just circumvent the entire that whole orthodoxy, that whole thing. Mm-hmm. Secondly, from a policy standpoint, if I were king for a day, what I would do is create what I call a food emancipation proclamation. And I know I'm using strong words, but essentially, our food system right now is held hostage by these overburdensome, overreaching regulations that are not about food safety. They're all about systems, infrastructure, and licensing. And so, if we allowed neighbor-to-neighbor commerce, so if you wanted to come around to my farm as a voluntary adult and as consenting adults, we exercise our freedom of choice, and I use all these words for a reason. And we want to engage in voluntary trade as neighbors. We should be able to do it without a bureaucrat being in the middle of that transaction.
Right.
Does that mean I'm an anarchist? No, I'm not. I'm not saying that we don't need government oversight for if I want to sell to Walmart or Sri Lanka or export to to Canada. What I am saying is that if we as neighbors want to engage in commerce, there should be a level, there should be some point at which it's not a government action,
right?
That we can engage in this.
Yeah, I think that's
so that would be, from a policy standpoint, that would certainly be one of the things that I would propose. I'll just say one other thing on this, that January 25th next year, I've gotten with a couple of other kind of rebels or lunatics or whatever,
all of the above.
Say. And we're gonna, in Cincinnati, Ohio, January 25th next year, will be what we call the Rogue Food Conference. And the slogan is circumvention, not compliance.
Nice.
And what we're finding is these onerous regulations have stimulated a tremendous amount of creativity. And so, for example, there's a lady in North Carolina that has started a 501c3 food church. You join the church, and you can trade in the community, and the government hates it. They've tried to stop her, but they can't because she's under the religious
it's the first church of the giant tomato. I love it.
Yeah. There's an outfit in Kentucky that actually has a storefront in Louisville, and it's a country club template. So
membership.
They have everything illegal to sell in there that you can imagine, but they don't sell it because you invest, you pay your dues in the country club, and your dues come back as dividends, so you trade your dividends in commerce. It's it's not public, and all of these mechanisms, these new little mechanisms, are are simply loopholes that some very clever people have figured out to keep these local neighbor-to-neighbor transactions from being in commerce. That's the phrase that gets you. That's when the government comes in. If it's in commerce, then you're in trouble. You can give away the pepperoni, you can give away raw milk, you can do all this stuff, you can give it away, but as soon as it enters commerce, then it's a hazardous substance.
What about
if there's a platform, if there's a tool we can use to create transactions that are not in commerce, then we're outside the government's purview. And so anyway, the Rogue Food Conference, January 25, 2020. You can just Google it up. Rogue Food Conference is all you need, and it'll pop right up a website. And we're real excited. But we've never done anything like this before. But
heck, I want to broadcast live from it.
When it's more efficient to circumvent than it is to comply.
Absolutely. And that's sad, when we've gotten to that point. And one of the gifts that this country has is its agriculture. It baffles me that we're doing this. And I'm sure that there are pockets being lined at the beneficiary end of it, because I can't see somebody saying, hey, this is logical. But Joel, I appreciate your time again. Polyfacefarms.com, Amazon, where you find everything I want to do is illegal. You have a wonderful weekend, and thank you for joining us.
Thank you for having me.
And thank you for tuning in. Go find your local farmers market, whether it's in the Star City or Lynchburg or Charlottesville. They're all over the place. You can find them. Until next week, let me grab that tomato from you there. Joe Thomas for our friends here at the Virginia Institute for Public Policy. So long, and thanks for all the fish.